And I became intrigued by what it was we were doing to works of art, works of literature in our seminars. We were taking things that somebody in the past had taken great care to make quite unique objects of great beauty, poems like a vase, can't be paraphrased or, have its meaning ripped out of it. And yet we would make this implicit thing explicit, and we would make this embodied thing disembodied, and we would take what was special and categorize it. And I wrote a book called Against Criticism, which is very hard to get hold of now, but one day I might reprint. And then I went off to do medicine to find out more about the mind-body problem. And when I was there, I just happened to go to a lecture by a colleague called John Cutting, who had just published a book with Oxford University Press called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because in my training, everything was about the left hemisphere. So I happened to go along to this, and it changed my life. And I'll explain why. He had spent 20 years sitting at the bedside of people who had some kind of right hemisphere injury, damage, stroke, tumor, and seeing what had happened to their take on the world. And it's much subtler than what happens after the left hemisphere injury, where you can't use your right hand, you can't speak. It's very barn door obvious. But something much more important happens after a right hemisphere stroke, which is that you don't really understand the world anymore. You don't understand what people mean. And he pointed to three things that were quite relevant to my move from the humanities into science, which was my dissatisfaction with this process of abstraction, disembodiment, and the turning of the unique into the general. And what he said was the left hemisphere only understands things as they belong to a category. The right hemisphere actually sees the unique instance. The left hemisphere sees things in a very abstract way. The right hemisphere sees things in relation to emotion and embodiment. It has much better connections with the body and with the part of the brain in which our emotions and our bodily sensations come to be merged with our thinking in a very important and valuable way. And so the right hemisphere understands the implicit, it understands metaphor, it understands humor, tone of voice, all these things that are so valuable in literature. And the left hemisphere doesn't get it at all. It takes everything very deadpan, like somebody who's, just can't understand what human beings mean. And so I realized that why I had not been able to, I found it very difficult at any rate, to overcome the difficulties in English of explaining why the implicit is more important than the explicit, why the embodied is more important than the abstract, why the unique is more important than the category. Why that was difficult was because the voice, my speaking, is all done by my left hemisphere, which doesn't understand it and hasn't generated vocabulary for it. So a colleague of mine who was a sinologist said, well, you might study Chinese because it has words for all these things. But so I had a toss-up. I'll either do medicine or Chinese, and medicine won. Anyway, what you're seeing there is three aspects of a vision of the world. It's not what they do in each case, which we've been told in the past, like the left hemisphere does reason, does language, the right hemisphere does emotion, does creativity. They're both involved in just about everything. And that had made a lot of people think, well, there's nothing in it, because we now know that actually they're both involved in everything. So end of the story. But no, that was just the beginning of the important story, which was to see that it's not what they do, but how they do it, that each hemisphere approaches whatever it's doing in a quite different way. And this is to do with attention. They attend to the world in two quite different ways that we need in order to survive. One is the attention that helps us grab stuff. It's a very narrow beam attention, precisely focused on a target, enables you to get your food, pick up a twig to build shelter, be quick and dirty and get and grab before the other guy. The right hemisphere, meantime, is looking out for everything else while you've got this very narrow attention going. Because if you had only that attention going, you'd soon become a prey to another predator. And you need to be understanding the whole of the scene around you. So the left hemisphere pays this very narrow beam, sharply focused attention to a detail, that it knows it wants, whereas the right hemisphere pays an uncommitted, broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention to the world as a whole. And that results in a significant difference in the way they have a take on the world. Because when you tend to the world differently, you see different things. You know, that's very obvious in daily life, that if you're interested in one thing, when you see something that somebody else sees as well, you're seeing two different things because your focus of interest is different. And there are many, many ways in which you can look at a human body. When you're appreciating a work of art, when you're doing a pathology examination, you know, when you're in bed with your lover, these are all completely different ways of experiencing the body. They have different kinds of attention, and they change, therefore, the experienced world. That means what, you know, we have these two ways of looking at the world. What are the main differences? And I'd say the main differences are that the left hemisphere sees disconnected fragments, which then have to be somehow put together in order to make something. It sees them as static, two-dimensional, categorical, either or, fixed entities, which are known and familiar and certain and can therefore be grasped, because the left hemisphere wants to grasp things. It actually controls your right hand, with which for most of us we grasp things. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is seeing that is a very artificial view. It's like a snapshot, which rather nicely the French call a cliché. In other words, it's got all the real life drained out of it. The right hemisphere sees a world that is living, constantly changing, complexly interconnected. Everything is interconnected ultimately to everything else, in which there are shades of meaning, in which nothing is ever completely repeated. There is uniqueness, the joy of discovering the unfamiliar, and so on. And that's a world to which we feel connected, whereas the left hemisphere's world is a world from which we feel detached, as though we're clinically observing it through a lens. Whereas in the right hemisphere's take, we are part of the world we're observing. So that's putting it as briefly and as broadly as I can. That gives the listener an idea.
Interesting.